We are supposed okay, got it. So we're talking about the Four Noble Truths and setting in motion the wheel of the Dhamma, which is supposedly the first teaching given by the Buddha. So you all know the Four Noble Truths, so I don't need to enumerate them. Just what I will do is I will talk about suffering today. Next time I will talk about the origin of suffering, and then the third time we'll talk about the last two truths. That's a program. So, as you all know, this is the central teaching of Buddhism. I would say personally that's what Buddhism is all about as far as I am concerned. But, you know, some people might have a different opinion, but that's the very basic teachings on which Buddhism is based. So the teaching is a sutta or a sutra, which is presented as a teaching given by the Buddha to some students, right? Now, this teaching was rehearsed or established after the passing away of the Buddha, when the Buddhist scriptures were established, at least at first, the two scriptures, the two baskets, the Sutta Pitaka and the Vinaya Pitaka about monastic discipline. It's debatable whether there was an Abhidhamma Pitaka. Probably this is a later creation. So this teaching was rehearsed, is the technical term, after the passing away of the Buddha. After the passing away of the Buddha, the monks gathered, and especially the Arhat gathered and recited the Vinaya and the Sutta part of the teaching. And so this is supposed to be a rendering of the first teaching given by the Buddha. Now, this is what it starts, thus I have heard. So somebody is reporting, it's not the Buddha who is talking, somebody is reporting what the Buddha said. That's how sutras work. Somebody is reporting what they heard the Buddha to be saying, right? In this case, it's Ananda, the cousin or the nephew, I think cousin of the Buddha. Though thus I have heard is Ananda, and in Ananda who is reciting, who is rehearsing this teaching and report what he remembers having heard the Buddha saying, right? Now, is this what the Buddha really said or not? That's a really difficult question, which we don't really know the answer. If you look at the teaching, you see it's quite complex, has a lot of category, and it's somehow dubious that the first teaching of the Buddha contained basically all the categories of the Buddhist world, but who knows? That's obviously a question, but it's not a very important question because that teaching is the basis of all Buddhist practice, and so it's not. We can be just happy with that and take it as the first teaching of the Buddha, given that it's a most basic teaching on which all the tradition and all Buddhist practice are based, right? So that's probably good enough. From a historical point of view, obviously, this is a different question. Remember, if you have questions, you can just interrupt me. We are a small group, and so We don't need to be formal. Sorry. Okay, so thus I have heard on one occasion the Blessed One was dwelling at Varanasi in the Deer Park at Isipatana. There the Blessed One addressed the bhikkhu of the group of 5 thus. So the story is the story of the Buddha with the 5 disciples, and they started austerities together. You remember that the Buddha left his home, supposedly a palace, and went in search of wisdom and gathered with a bunch of other ascetic who were practicing austerities. And so the 5 monks are the 5 people who were together with him. And so the Buddha start his teaching by, in a way, explaining why he left them. Bhikkhu, these 2 extremes should not be followed by one who has gone forward into homelessness. What are the 2? The pursuit of sensual happiness, in sensual pleasure, which is low, vulgar, etc., without, and the pursuit of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, and beneficial. So why is the Buddha saying that at first? In a way, he's saying, this is why I left you. And so the Buddha left the 5 people, the 5 monks, and the 5 monks were really unhappy. And so they swore to each other that if the Buddha would come back, they would not pay any attention to him. But supposedly when the Buddha showed up, they were all kind of magically drawn by his presence. And so they requested this teaching. But the Buddha tells them right away, this is what the practice should be. It should neither be indulgent in sensory pleasure, nor should it be self-mortification, which is what the 5 monks had done and the Buddha had done before he left them, right? And so this is what is setting up the scene for the teaching. And what because is a middle way awakened by the Tathagata, which gives right to vision, which leads to Nibbana. It is this noble eightfold path that is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This bhikkhu is a middle way awakened by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads peace to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to Nibbana. Okay, so that's a middle path. And we'll come back to the Eightfold Path, because the Eightfold Path is what the Buddha is going to teach as the truth of the path, right? Okay, so now this bhikkhu is a noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, union. I don't like the word union, but anyway, usually it's in meeting with what is displeasing is suffering, separation from what is pleasing is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the 5 aggregate subject to clinging are suffering. Okay, so this is the beginning of the heart of what Buddhism is about. Okay, so suffering, right? That's a description of the nature of what it means to be a sentient being. So when I teach this to students, I like to think about who we are. And who we are can be described as homeodynamic system in a constant exchange with the environment. What does homeodynamic system means? It means a system which has its own balance, but which is constantly in the process of reestablishing or maintaining this balance in its exchange with the environment. That's a modern term of thermodynamic, but I think it's an excellent entry into what Buddhist means by suffering, because otherwise it looks like people are being dour, which is not the point. The point is to understand who we are as sentient being. And who we are as sentient being is being who have their own metabolism, which is constantly in exchange, in relation with the environment, right? If we were deprived of oxygen, we would die within 5 minutes, 3 minutes, something like this. If we're deprived of water, we would die within 1 day. If we are deprived of food, we can last quite a bit longer. But as you can see, we're in constant exchange and relation with the environment. And so that exchange, or that system, which is that metabolic system, which is in exchange with the environment, has basically 3 positions. It can be in balance, it can be balanced, it can be out of balance, and it can be getting back to balance. Okay? So we can be in balance, we don't need anything, we're just resting peacefully. We are out of balance, or we're getting back to balance. Now, I said we are sentient beings, which I think is a better term than the Tibetan term. The Tibetan term is semchen, which is minded beings, which means literally beings with mind. I think to say we're sentient beings is actually better, because it shows that what is most important for us is feeling, how we feel about the situation. Remember, we're in constant exchange with our environment, and that exchange, in that exchange, we can have 3 states. Either we are out of balance, or we are in balance, or we are getting back to balance. Okay? Now you may think, what does that have to do with suffering? Well, it has an enormous amount to do with suffering, because when we are out of balance, this is unpleasant feeling. When we are in balance, this is neutral feeling. And when we're getting back to balance, it's pleasant feelings. And it is this feeling that basically dictate how we live our life, how we behave, and so on, right? So, unpleasant feelings, we all know what that means. Physical, mental. It's suffering, right? And then we can be neutral. We don't have any unpleasant feeling, nor have we pleasant feeling. We're just neutral. And then we can be getting back to balance. And this is what we call pleasant feelings, right? This is what we think happiness is about. Happiness, ordinary happiness, is about getting back to balance, right? I am hungry, I eat. I think this is a wonderful happiness. Actually, what it is that I'm just getting back into balance. And that's what I mistake, or that's what I resent, that's what I experience as happiness, right? That's just getting back to balance. I am thirsty, I am drinking, great. And that's what we think is happiness. Actually, if you understand the system dynamically, you realize that, yeah, it is a pleasant feeling, but it's just the system getting back in balance from a state of unbalance, right? When I'm thirsty, my body is not in balance with the environment. And so I drink, that feels really good, and nothing wrong with that. But it's just the body getting back to a state of balance, right? And the truth of suffering is that we're constantly engaged in this relation, which is kind of a struggle with the environment, which can be other sentient beings or the natural environment. We're in constant exchange, we're in constant struggle with this environment, and we're constantly striving to either be in balance or getting back to balance, right? And because we are impermanent, this is not going to last, right? This is a losing fight. Yes. Unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your teachings. So you're saying that it's the process of regaining balance that we derive pleasure from, not the state of being in balance.
That's right. When you're in balance, you don't feel anything. You're neutral, right?
I would think not, because when you're in balance and everything is how you want it to be. It doesn't last, but that feeling.
When you sleep, for example, it's neutral, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
When
it's happy, it's when there is a contrast between the state you are in and the state you were, right?
Interesting.
And this is what I call getting back into balance.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, thank you.
So it's very simple. It's the truth of suffering is just the truth of who we are as beings who are directed by sentience, meaning feeling, right? And who are using feeling to manage the interaction with the environment understood as not just the natural world, but also other human beings and animals and other sentient beings. And so the truth of suffering is the truth of us, of this constant struggle in which we engage to try to remain in balance, right? And that's the truth of suffering. And that truth of suffering is, in a way, very simple, right? It's just the truth of who we are as sentient beings. And the basis of that truth is obviously the impermanence, the constant change of the world, the constant change we undergo, and the fact that even if we are in balance, that state cannot last, and we are going fatally to get out of balance and hence engage in that constant struggle, which is basically what it means to be a sentient being. Tibetans use the 3 levels of suffering, which I think comes from Asanga, but I'm not completely sure about that, which I think is very nice because it's in a way dovetail quite closely what we have been talking about. So the truth of the suffering, the 3 levels of suffering are the suffering of the suffering of suffering, the suffering of change, and the suffering of conditioned existence. And these 3 levels of suffering are in a way connected with the 3 types of feeling I've been talking about. Pain, pleasure, neutral, right? Suffering of suffering is the suffering that we all identify as suffering. Can be physical, can be mental. That's when our organism is out of sync with the environment, understood very broadly, because it doesn't need to be physical pain. It can be mental anguish. It can be separation from one's loved one, not getting what one wants, and so on, right? And so that state is a state of suffering and is a state in which we are out of balance, right? And that's a state which we all identify naturally as suffering. Nobody needs to tell us that being sick or losing a loved one sucks. We all know it sucks, and we all identify it as suffering, and even animals do the same, right? That's called suffering of suffering. And that's a dovetail with the feeling with painful feeling, which is the manifestation of our being out of balance with the environment we interact with, right? And then we get back into balance, and that's pleasurable, right? That feels good. And that's called the suffering of change, right? In Buddhism, that's one of the first teachings that I received, which is the suffering of change, right? So the suffering of change is, what is the suffering of change? There are all the pleasurable feelings that we have, be they mental or physical, right? And these feelings are called suffering of change. Why is that called suffering of change? Because if you undergo them, they change into suffering. So, for example, the example that is usually given by teacher is food. You're hungry, you eat food, that's delicious, and when you eat more, that's less delicious, and so on. So you see where I'm going. Gradually, that experience of that pleasurable experience that was eating food turns into its opposite, right? Why does it turn with its opposite? Because eating food is not pleasurable in itself. It's pleasurable if you are hungry. It's a way for the organism to get back in balance. And so when you're out of balance and you're hungry, food tastes really good, right? If you're not so hungry, it's okay, but it's not really that great, right? And that's the nature of the suffering. That's why it's called the suffering of change, because if you undergo that experience, it changes into its opposite. And the reason is all explained by my discussion of our being a metabolic being who are in constant interaction with the environment, and that constant interaction with the environment, through that interaction, we seek to maintain our balance, but because of the nature of reality, which is to change, this is not possible, and so we're constantly struggling to reassert this balance, and that's when we feel pleasure, right? Feels good. The best food is the food that you eat when you are really hungry, right? It's not, there is nothing intrinsic in the taste of food. The hungrier you are, the better the food is going to taste. And that just shows that this, what we take to be happiness, is actually, it's pleasurable, it's happiness in a way, but it's a limited happiness because it's just a system getting back to balance, right? And once a system gets back in balance, what was a pleasurable experience turns out to be not so pleasurable after all, and even to turn into its opposite, right? And that's the teaching about the suffering of change. So the suffering of suffering is the suffering that we all identify as suffering. The suffering of change is what we identify as pleasure, right? Okay, so what we have pleasure, we have pain, and so the third one is neutral state, right? And that's called the suffering of conditioned existence. Okay, so what is the suffering of conditioned existence? Well, it's explained in the Buddhist teaching through the 5 aggregates. Now this bhikkhu is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, union with what is displeasing is suffering, separation from what is pleasing is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are suffering, right? That's the truth of suffering. Now, birth is suffering, aging is suffering. Birth is the beginning of the process, right? We're born, and when we're born, we enter this cycle of constant interaction with our environment, again, understood in the broadest possible term. And in that interaction, we seek to maintain our balance, but because the nature of reality is to be constantly changing, including ourselves, this is a struggle, right? Because things are constantly changing, and so we need to constantly reset our system in order to try to cope with the changes that happen in us and around us, right? That's the truth of suffering. So birth is suffering because birth is the beginning of that process. Obviously, I don't need to tell you that aging is suffering. Illness is suffering, death is suffering. We kind of all know that. But what we kind of forget is that, or don't fully face, is the fact that birth implies death, right? And human beings are constantly trying to escape that truth. But if you understand what I've been saying, you understand that this constant struggle that we engage in is, well, it cannot go on forever, right? The organism wears down, and so at some point, that struggle is going to stop, right? And that's called death. And yeah, we tend to forget that. We tend to kind of push this in the background, and this is as if this is what not the surest thing that will happen to us. But it is the surest thing that will happen to us because we were born. And when we are born as this organism which is in constant exchange with the environment. And in that process, we grow, but we cannot grow indefinitely. And the constant struggle has a price. And at some point, something is going to go wrong, right? And that's, now we have medicine, which is great. It can make us go longer, but I have a good laugh when I hear people talking about in the future we will not die or something like this. No, that would be a catastrophe. If human beings would not die, that would be a total catastrophe. The human race would disappear very quickly. No, we will die, and science can help, and maybe we will get to 100 or 120 years old, and that would be, I guess, probably a good thing, probably, I don't know. But the reality is that when we're born, we're starting this process of exchange with the environment. And so that process is costly, wears down the organism, and at some point, things will go down wrong and we will die. And this is what the Buddha seemed to be saying. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering. I think we all know that. Death is suffering, and death is a natural consequence of being born, because we are born as this homeodynamic being, which is in constant exchange with the environment. We're not born as an isolated being who is in the cocoon, which preserves him forever, right? This is not who we are. So, not to get what one is, in brief, the five aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. So, what the teaching on suffering is talking about is the nature of who we are, right? And the nature of who we are is to be born and then change and die. Now, some people think this is pessimistic. I personally don't think so, but obviously everybody has their own opinion. I think this is just pretty realistic description of the human condition. And from my point of view, we kid ourselves if we don't understand that fundamental condition. And so that fundamental condition is to be born, to change, and then to die. And so who we are is this homeodynamic being in constant exchange with the environment. And that homeodynamic being is understood traditionally in the earliest teaching as composite of the 5 aggregates, right? So the 5 aggregates is rupa, the body, vedana, feeling, samnya, cognition, I guess it's usually translation, samskara, which is associated factor, and vijnana or vijnana, consciousness, right? And the idea is that this homeodynamic being is not a unified being, but is composed of different parts. And this is what is enumerated here as the 5 aggregates. Now, you may think it's kind of a strange way to understand human beings. And obviously, if we were doing systematically, we would say body and mind, right? And then we would have to talk about mind. And so mind is talked here as having different parts: consciousness, which is the awareness of object, and then mental factors, which is how this, which is the qualitative nature of that awareness. So, for example, we are aware of a certain object and we feel good about that object, right? That's a quality of our awareness. Or we feel bad about that object. That's a quality of our awareness. And that's due to Vedana, which is feeling, sometimes translated as sensation, right? And sensation or feeling is absolutely essential to being not just a human being, but to being a sentient being, because it is feeling that allows us to deal with our environment, deal with other beings. How do we deal with that? Well, if it feels good, we want more. If it feels bad, we don't want it. If it feels neutral, we just keep going, right? And most our behavior is absolutely dictated by this factor of Vedana, feeling, sensation, how we feel about the situation, how we feel about our experience. That's why I think it's not exactly a translation, but the idea of sentient being is exactly the right word. We are sentient being because we're beings who are directed by sentience, right? How we feel about the situation. Is this a hand?
Yeah, Professor. I would just want to ask you, feelings in the Buddhist context, is it partly biological and partly, our habit patterns from karma, or is it all karma?
Well, that's a difficult question because you're trying to bring together different things. Okay, so no, it's not necessarily biological because it can be mental, right? Now, you may say as a 21st century person that it's actually the mind is biological, but that's certainly not how the Buddhist tradition presents it. It presents it just as how things appear to us, and there is body and mind, right? And so feeling can be mental or it can be physical, right? Now, so that's okay. Now, obviously, we can ask what's the nature of the mind? Is it physical? Is it not physical? But that's a different kind of inquiry, right? The question of karma makes it infinitely more complicated because nobody knows except the Buddha. Okay? Nobody knows. Right? If you ask, why was I born in Switzerland? Well, there is a kind of materialist answer, right? But if you want to talk about karma, it's like, I had the karma to be born in Switzerland. Apparently, I don't know. Now, what was the karma? Well, if there was a fully enlightened person in this room, and I don't see any, I would ask that fully enlightened being and ask him or her, what is the karma which made me born in Switzerland a few years ago, right? In the absence of that fully enlightened person, we don't know. And so we have to think about karma mostly from a prospective perspective. That is, we have to assume that karma, there is a working of karma, and that therefore we need to do good things, right? But actually, to understand karma, not possible.
Maybe I'm not asking it correctly, but I was just wondering, just from the feeling of like a pleasant feeling, it's like, why is it that, just for a silly example, like why would a baby choose, a soft cuddly toy of a teddy bear versus a soft cuddly toy or play with other children? Like, just at that basic level. So maybe biological is not the right word, but like, what makes you gravitate to something you like and somebody else gravitate to something else?
When you ask to Tibetan teachers, they give you a different answer. So the honest answer is, I don't know. I really don't know. Now, some teacher will say everything is directed by karma. All the experience that you have is a product of karma. Other teachers say, no, not at all. It's just, your body, you have a physical body, and so you encounter various objects or various experience, and so your body reacts as a biological organism, and that's why you have a pleasant experience. Personally, that's what makes more sense to me. But, then it's like, well, what about karma? Well, we don't quite know. Right? Because maybe 200 years ago, I did something good and that's what produced this experience. How do I know? How would I know? In my final exam, they were debating me on this question, and that was my position, that we don't know, only the Buddha knows. And all what we can do is believe in karma, because that's an important regulative notion, right? Because we need to regulate ourselves. We need to behave, not to indulge into our every whims and desires, right? Or every movement of passion, because otherwise we are like Donald Trump, and that's probably not what we want to be. And so, yeah, karma is important, but how karma works, karma is important as a regulative idea, as a prospective idea about, if I do something that's not going to work well for me, it works like this. Now, as a retrospective idea, more difficult, right? Yeah. So what were we talking about? Oh, the 5 aggregates, right? Do you have a question? Anybody? So what we're talking about is the nature of who we are, right? And the nature of who we are is to be composite, to be impermanent, and therefore and to be no self. And therefore, we are in this situation, right, of struggling with suffering. So I talked about the change, right? The fact that we are born, and as soon as we're born, we constantly change. And the reason we change is that we engage in that struggle with change, right? And we are constantly involved in that struggle. And that's just the nature of what it means to be a sentient being. And then who we are also is this composite being made of body and mind. And if you were talking about mind, you would talk about sensation, recognition, composite factors, and consciousness, which is just pointing to the composite nature of the mind, right? Now, if you thought you were a self distinct from these 5 aggregates, you could think that your true nature is to be beyond suffering. But that's not how the teaching of the Four Noble Truths think about who we are, right? Who we are is this composite being who is born, changes, and therefore dies. And there is nothing over and above that. There is no self which is deeper than the 5 aggregates. The 5 aggregates is just who we are. Therefore, the truth of suffering is understood to have 4 aspects: suffering, impermanence, 3 aspects, sorry, and no self. Sometimes no self and empty are separate, and then it's 4. These are the 3 or 4 characteristics of the truth of suffering. And the truth of suffering is just the nature of who we are. And I started this description by using this notion of thermodynamic, which is this homeodynamic being, because I think it's a way to understand who we are in a dynamic way, which is very much what the Buddhist tradition understand who we are. And so who we are is this homeodynamic being who is in constant exchange and struggle with the environment, and therefore changes, suffers, and there is no self over and beyond that composite being which I describe as homeodynamic being, but the teaching described it as the 5 aggregates, right? 1 mental aggregate, 1 physical aggregate and 4 mental aggregates. And so that's an important part of the teaching about about suffering, because if there were a self which is beyond suffering, then we could, in a way, take refuge in this self, right? Now, this is one Buddhist teaching. There are other Buddhist teachings that kind of partly contradict this teaching, but that's a basic teaching, right? And the basic teaching is a description of who we are as sentient being, right? And sentient being are characterized as having these 3 kinds of experience: being in pain, suffering, meaning out of balance, being in balance, neutral, and being going back to balance, right? And all these 3 states, these 3 kinds of experience are part of this, are expressions, if you want to put it like this, of who we are as homeodynamic beings in constant exchange with the environment, right? And so that process is characterized by being suffering, impermanent, and no self. And that's the First Noble Truth. So basically, that's all what I have to say for today. But if you have questions, I will be delighted to answer them.
I was wondering whether or not you're going to focus in terms of the course on some of the other aspects of, in other words, the aspects of the Four Noble Truths. I've read about the 16 aspects and just don't know very much about that.
No, the 16 aspects are not very interesting. What is interesting is the 4 aspects of the truth of suffering: impermanence, suffering, no self, emptiness. Now, emptiness here means, usually is understood to mean something like absence of a kind of an eternal self. So it's not emptiness like in the Prajnaparamita Sutra. It's emptiness understood as a more at a kind of more superficial level, which is the fact that we don't have a self which is over and or beyond these 5 aggregates, right? All what we have is all what we are these 5 aggregates. We have this composite.
I'm sorry, could you just repeat those 4 again? Forgive me, I just couldn't get them.
No, that's okay. That's impermanence, suffering, no self, emptiness. This is the 4 characteristic of the truth of suffering. And then the other 12 are basically not terribly interesting. They're gloss on, so for example, the origin of suffering, there are several ways to call it the origin, but basically it's calling the origin of suffering. So the other 12 are not terribly interesting. The interesting one are the first 4, because they provide really important information about who we are, right?
Yeah.
The later 12 are kind of paraphrase of the last 3 truth, right? And the truth or origin of suffering, obviously, I will talk about it in some details because that's obviously extremely important, right? But I think the truth of suffering is probably enough for today. Yes.
Professor, thank you for the teachings. This is a lovely topic, and I just want to follow up on Richard's question. Sorry, what?
I say I'm not so sure it's so lovely, but you know, this is what it is, right?
Well, so my question is just to follow up on Richard's
Yes,
question
please.
about these 16 characteristics, right? And then you talked about 4.
Yes.
But you know, I haven't. I mean, I've read about these characteristics, but the way that you talk about it is, okay, these 4 are associated with the truth of suffering.
Yes.
But the way that you've actually presented it, which is, you know, it makes sense to me is, well, these 4, I don't know why they are related to the truth of suffering, but it seems like from what you said,
Yes.
they are more related to this dynamic being.
Well, that's what the truth of suffering is all about. It's this dynamic being, right? Now, you're right that the 4 characteristics are not exclusively connected to the truth of suffering because it's also connected to the origin of suffering, right? So that's fair enough. But why is it connected with the truth of suffering is that unless you understand these 4 characteristics, you're not understanding what Buddhists mean by the truth of suffering. That's what you need to understand suffering. Because if you think suffering is just the fact that we have bad experience, that's a very limited understanding of suffering, right? The Buddhist understanding of suffering is based on this idea of who we are, right, as sentient beings. And so to understand who we are as sentient beings, you need to understand the 4 characteristics. Because if you don't understand that, well, you will understand suffering, but if you don't understand impermanence, you don't understand why is it that we're suffering, right? And then if you don't understand no self, you're going to think that, okay, body and mind is suffering, but my true self is remote, is free from suffering. And that is not the understanding of the Four Noble Truths as explained, of the truth of suffering as explained here.
Therefore, what you're saying is that in our very makeup, this system, this dynamic system, has these characteristics of impermanence, suffering, insubstantiality, and emptiness. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And you're saying that in itself is the definition of suffering.
Exactly. That's what it means from a Buddhist point of view to suffer, right? To be under the truth of suffering. Because it doesn't mean we are suffering in the ordinary term, because, you know, most of us are not sick. We're kind of old, but we can still keep going for a little while. So we're not really suffering immediately, but we are under this condition of being impermanent and no self, right? And so that means that we are this kind of being which is in constant exchange with its environment and go through this 3 kinds of experience. And that's what the truth of suffering is. And so it's an understanding of who we are.
Got it. Thank you. That clarifies it. And if I may just follow up with another one, which is that you know, they often talk about these aggregates, right?
Yes,
And aggregates subject to clinging, but they talk about the aggregates as contaminated aggregates. And
yes,
is the word contaminated used, which I've seen sometimes, right?
yes, yes.
Is that used just because it is it's contaminated with karma and suffering?
Yeah, with klesha and karma, and we'll talk about that next time.
Got it. Okay,
That's
thank
why
you.
it's called contaminated, right?
One more question, just
Yes,
if you
please.
don't mind, regarding it. I just want to make sure that I understand the point about conditioned suffering.
Yeah,
If I understand what you're saying, it's basically the human condition. It's the condition of being, or the condition of sentient beings. It's the condition of simply being alive and having and being, as you put it, a homeodynamic system in relation to the world. Is that correct?
yes, but now I have to say that this word homeodynamic is not a Buddhist word,
Of course, yeah,
a
yeah.
thermodynamic word, but I think it's very helpful because it introduced, you know, we have the tendency to think we are this solid being who is facing this reality made of solid entities, right? And that's a very misleading way to understand ourselves and to understand the world around us, right? And I think this term of thermodynamic is introducing a notion of change, which I think is very germane to how the Buddhists think about the nature of reality as being constantly changing, right? And I think that's a term that I use when I teach the truth of suffering to my students, because I think it gives them a way to step in, right? When I was taught in the monastery or before getting to the monastery, we just talked about the 3 types of suffering, right? And that's a very traditional, at least Tibetan way of explaining suffering. And I think it's a very profound teaching. And I think that teaching is helped by understanding ourselves as this homeodynamic being, because it introduced this notion of change and how we interact with the environment and how we struggle to constantly maintain ourselves as this self-organizing being, right? And I think that's helped us, or at least helped me, and I think helped my student to understand better what Buddhists mean by the truth of suffering. Because if you read the teaching, it's a little dour, right?
Well, I think that's actually very helpful. And one of the things I do is facilitate an introductory Buddhism class, and of course we talk about the truth of suffering. And I'm going to use this term, you know,
Yeah,
with all the caveats that you've placed on it, that it's a new
yeah,
term.
yeah. Anything more? More question? Because basically I'm done.
Okay, I have a question, Professor.
Yes.
So going back to again the 4 characteristics of the first noble truth. So the first 2, impermanence and suffering. I was thinking, in the context that Buddha is teaching with all the other non-Buddhist schools, that is common with them. But then when he's saying that there is no, you can't find, some pure, not pure, what is the word? Some, eternal self that will always be there. And neither can you find it, apart from your 5 aggregates. That's like talking to, the Brahminical tradition or whatever, saying, if you go down that route, you won't be free of suffering, right? That's not a path to liberation.
That's what the teaching seemed to be implying. Yeah, That's the basic Buddhist view of who we are, right? Yeah. Now,
and
the criticism of the other tradition actually starts with the Buddha talking about the middle path, right? And that's an explicit criticism of the other tradition, or maybe not explicit, but implicit criticism of the other tradition, because there were, and there still are, people who practice austerities in India, right? By austerity, I mean really who inflict themselves pain, you know, keeping their arm raised forever, and so on, fasting for days and days, and so on. So there are people who really do this penance, and that's something that the Buddha doesn't condone. And then on the other hand, he doesn't condone indulgence in sensory pleasure. And that's obviously in part, or I think it can be read as being directed at Brahmins.
sorry, directed at who?
Brahmins.
Oh, Brahmins. Okay.
Yes. Because, yeah, that's the Dharma, the teaching is called setting in motion the wheel of Dharma, right? Or Dhamma. And this title is a kind of provocation, right? Because the Dharma of the Brahmins is very different, right? The Dharma of the Brahmins is how you live your life as a person who is born in a particular condition. Let's call it caste, or however you want to call it. And the way you fulfill your Dharma is by doing the kind of action which are entailed by the caste to which you belong. So, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, which is obviously a later teaching, but talks about how the duty of Kshatriya warriors is to fight, right? And when Arjuna complains that he doesn't want to kill his relatives and to fight against his relative and so on, he is told, well, that's your Dharma and you should embrace your Dharma. So that's the Brahmanical sense of Dharma, which is a function of the position that you occupy in the total ritual cosmic context, right? And the Buddha is saying, no, the true Dharma is not the Dharma, is not the set of duties and practices that derive from your birth, but is the practices, the set of practices that are going to liberate you from there. And that's a very revolutionary way of putting it, because it's saying this is what Dharma really is. It's not what the Brahmins are teaching. It's the way to overcome the suffering of being a human being, right? And so that's this opposition between the Dharma of the Buddha and the Dharma of the Brahmin, right? Now, obviously, Brahmanical tradition is very complex, and I'm not claiming that I captured the entirety of the Brahmanical tradition, but that's the opposition that this teaching is making between the Dharma of the Buddha and the Dharma of the Brahmin.
And if I could also ask on these four characteristics, I first heard about the 3 marks of existence, which are like the first 3 characteristics.
Yeah.
I didn't know that the Four Noble Truths had these 16 characteristics. So when I saw these, I thought, why are they being repeated here? Or I didn't know which came first, like the 3 marks of existence, or
this is the first teaching.
so okay. So later teachers then just took those
Well,
those
as you understand as you saw in this teaching, the Buddha is not talking explicitly about this characteristic, right? He's only talking, it's the commentators who look at what the Buddha says and then extract these 4 characteristics. And so there is no question. I mean, you know, they're the same thing. 3 marks of existence, the 4 characteristics of the truth of suffering. It's exactly the same thing, right? And it's not the Buddha who said there are 3, no, there are 4. It's the basic teaching is that birth is suffering, aging is suffering, etc., etc. The 5 aggregates are suffering, right? And when the Buddha said the 5 aggregates are suffering, that includes the idea of no self, or that maybe entails rather the idea of no self, right? So these 4 characteristics, 3 marks, were kind of derived by commentators who read these texts like we have done, and who say, well, that's what these texts are really saying. And I think they're not wrong.
Thank you.
The Buddha, I mean, there is a real difference in the way Tibetans and Theravadins deal with the teachings of the Buddha, in the sense that in the Theravadin tradition, they tend to make you read the basic teachings of the Buddha a lot more than in the Tibetan tradition, because the Tibetan tradition is later, and so tend to base itself on commentary much more than on direct contact with the teachings of the Buddha, right? This is obviously not a criticism, it's just talking about the interpretive strategy of this tradition, which is slightly different, though at the end of the day, it comes down to pretty much the same thing, right?
Thank you. I think Sunny has a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sneh. Yeah, my question is maybe a little bit naive, but or based on my Christian background, because so studying Buddhism, okay, go through along the path and gradually rid oneself of obscurations, the negativity, and purify the the homeodynamic being, right?
Okay.
So then where does and you say that all along there will be suffering. So where does the nature, am I misunderstanding the nature of the Buddha nature, that somewhere at the end, like,
we're not talking about that now.
and so it's like, but that sounds like dualistic.
No, I don't think, I'm not sure what you mean by dualistic. It's not dualistic. It's just talking about the nature of being a sentient being, what it means to be a sentient being, right? Now, you may ask, once you have completed the path, what's going on, right? But that's the 3rd and 4 Noble Truths. We'll talk about that. But as you can imagine, different Buddhists are going to have different opinions on that question.
Yeah.
Because that's a difficult question, right? The easier question is the truth of suffering and the origin of suffering.
Right. So the question of whether or not.
So I have an easier task for the class number 1 and 2, and then class number 3. That will be a little bit more difficult, because this is where Buddhists kind of differ, right?
Maybe because a lot of people don't know.
It's difficult.
It's difficult. It's like if you attain Buddha nature, you cease being a sentient being. Is that true?
What's that? No. But there are questions. I mean, the notion of Buddha nature is complicated, but it is a notion of, it can be understood as a notion of something which is beyond suffering.
Interesting. Okay. I
So
think
it's not the only understanding. There is a conflict of interpretation in the Buddhist tradition. Some traditions think of this Buddha nature as some kind of pure consciousness. But then the problem is that that pure consciousness looks like a real self. And so most Buddhist tradition, I'm talking now about Tibetan Mahayanist tradition, right? Most Mahayanist tradition kind of recoil to go that far and tend to try to conciliate this idea of Buddha nature with this idea of truth of suffering, no self, and so on.
Mhm.
That's a
Okay.
deep
Thank you.
that's a deep conflict of interpretation in the Buddhist tradition, which does not pertain to the first noble truth, but pertain to the third noble truth, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't. It's not. It doesn't. In the West, it gets mixed up with the concept of a soul. You know, like the Christianity. You know, the soul goes to God, and that's
Well, you know, if
that's
there is something which is beyond suffering, then it does look like a soul, right?
yeah,
It does.
right.
So,
But it's not.
well, that doesn't concern us today, but that's in the Mahayana tradition, that's a very deep debate.
Mm. Okay, thank you.
But
Look forward to session
today,
3.
if you read this, that's
Mhm.
not a question, right?
Right, right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Savanch?
Professor, I had one more question. You know, so this is the start, right? This is the first teaching, and it's you know, the Buddha lays out, right, the noble truth of suffering. But you know, if I look at this list, I think that there's, you know, there's another, and I say this to myself, right? No doubt, no doubt. You know, this list is true, valid, everything, right? I mean, it speaks to suffering, but at a more fundamental level, the idea of stability, the idea that things are I am solid and that things are solid. That the conflict between the experience of that and the experience of this thing called impermanence, you know, this is not brought out right away, correct? But
Yeah.
it seems very fundamental. It seems very, you know, speaks to the core of at least my being.
Yes. Yes. We are beings who crave for stability. No question. That's what we want. And the first noble truth is saying, well, this is not how things are, right? And this is why we suffer. Basically, you're talking about why we suffer, right? We suffer because we have this craving for stability, for being, and that craving cannot be satisfied because we are this homeodynamic being in constant exchange with the environment, right? And so we are constantly changing. Reality is changing around us. And that's what accounts for how we go through the 3 types of experience. And for this text, this is where suffering comes from, right? From our inability to live attuned to this basic reality of change. And you're right, it's a big shock. I mean, it's a huge shock, right? When we're confronted by change, it's now sometimes change is good, but often it's disturbing, right?
Thank you.
Okay, anything more? So next time we'll talk about the origin of suffering, right? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. See you next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Snipe.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Good night.
Good night.